In 1984, George Orwell wrote, in 1949, George Orwell wrote 1984. Are we heading to a dystopian society? We'll find out. It's Rob Nelson Live. Hey, everybody on all your social platforms, Reddit, Facebook, YouTube, Twitch, Twitter, TikTok. Welcome to Rob Nelson Live, our Friday night rock and roll special. I don't know why I said that. As always, streaming to you from our virtual studios in LA and Florida on the beach, and to you wherever you are. Thanks for being part of it. Join in, engage. Let's get hyper interactive. Love the comments. You guys build them up as we go. I try to talk about as many of them as I can. And you guys, of course, go at it with each other. And if you like what you're seeing, share, follow, do all those things. All right, let's jump right into it. I called this episode, Fairness is Overrated. And the reason is that Lester Holt, the head of the NBC lead anchor at NBC News, this week got awarded the very prestigious Edward R. Murrow Journalism Award for a lifetime achievement. Edward R. Murrow was like an icon of journalism and reporting. And just like literally, even today, I think he would have been like free of all scandal. He was the penultimate. That's a trick. It's not penultimate. He was the ultimate journalist. And penultimate means you're like down below. And he got awarded it. And and people on the right sometimes have a problem with Lester Holt. He talks like that old school journalist guy, and he's definitely left of center, but he considers himself a true journalist, objective. And this is a tiny piece of what he had to say in his acceptance speech that just stunned me.
I think it's become clearer that fairness is overrated. The idea that we should always give two sides equal weight and merit does not reflect the world we find ourselves in. That the sun sets in the west is a fact. Any contrary view does not deserve our time or attention. Now, I know recent events assure that you won't have to look far to find more current and relevant examples. I think you get my point.
I'm like, wow. Okay. In journalism, fairness is overrated. I mean, he goes on to talk about how misinformation shouldn't be given a platform. I get it, right? But, the sun sets in the west, so if someone says the sun sets in the east, you don't have to listen to them. Okay, maybe. Although I don't even know. I'm like a pretty extreme, like let all sides out. I mean, if someone wants to say, but I get it. You don't want to give just a wild platform, but he's not really talking about that. As he says, current events. He's talking about things like election fraud around COVID. He talks about when it affects public health, safety, elections. Okay, first of all, we're not in a sun sets in the west versus doesn't set in the west context with any of these things. COVID is not the sun sets in the west. I get that there is science behind COVID. You all know there's also a lot of science that has been put out, changed, developed as we've grown to understand it. Things they said in the beginning, they changed science as we knew more. Now you could say, but there's some hard fact sciences like COVID is an infectious disease. Yes. Okay. But COVID is not the sun sets in the west. And there's a lot of debate about things around COVID. There's a lot of debate about the effectiveness of wearing a mask, all the time. There's a lot of debate about whether you should have to get a vaccine, whether it could hurt your body because it's a new genetically altered thing. There's all kinds of debate around the effectiveness of lockdowns. It's not the sun sets in the west, and we just don't even know enough for it to be even possible. Maybe in 20 years you could say that. Even then, I don't know. Same with elections. Sure, Trump's claim that the election was a wide-scale fraud was not true. But nonetheless, it's not the sun sets in the west. As I've said the whole time, there certainly was fraud. There's fraud in every election. Was it what Trump claimed? No. Is it the media's job to decide we're simply not going to allow you to have certain viewpoints because we've decided they're wrong? That's the issue for me. We, the media, have decided that's misinformation. We're not going to report it. Well, where that shows up, and by the way, same thing would be true, right? With racism. Is there racism? Of course. Is everything someone says racist? Racist? Is critical race theory accurate? I don't think so. Again, not the media's job to be deciding for me. The whole notion of the society we live in, of a democracy we live in, is that there's, and our justice legal system, there's two sides to everything. You imagine a court case where you're like, you don't get to say, we're not going to listen to you because you're lying. Now, granted, you take an oath on a Bible, but still people lie. And either way, people see things differently. So you can't say, no, your side is wrong. We're not even going to hear it. You get to hear it. A jury gets to decide. I've said before, judges decide matters of law. Juries decide matter of facts. We have juries to decide which facts they think are true, and judges who say this is what's allowed within the legal framework. The jury gets to decide if they believe person A or person B. The judge doesn't decide for them and say, nope, don't get to say that because I've decided it's not true. Jurors are the deciders of fact. The media is not the decider of fact. The media is supposed to present it all to us. I got a real problem saying fairness is overrated. And I'm a Libra, so for me, fairness is everything. Literally. I always try to see two sides of everything, even if I think you're completely wrong. But if you want to go with the sun always sets in the west, and therefore the media, according to Lester Holt, should be the arbiter, the decider of what information gets to get equal time or any time at all, they got to stop reporting on trans issues the way they are, because I have a feeling biological sex is probably the oldest since the dawn of man and before the dawn of all, most creation. The notion of a biological sex, of biological sexes, goes back thousands and thousands of years in science. I think it's a pretty widely accepted fact that there are two biological sexes, no matter what gender you want to choose, no matter whether you want to change it. And again, some people will argue biological sex is not determinative. Okay, I'm going to let you have that argument. But according to Lester Holt, that argument shouldn't even be allowed, because as much as the sun sets in the west and rises in the east, there have been two biological sexes, male and female, since the dawn of time. Well, the dawn of man. So where does this all go for me? Well, I started this out saying in 1984, in 1949, George Orwell wrote the dystopian novel 1984. Right now, throughout the last 70 years, people have argued, were we in 1984? When 1984 hit, Apple had the big 1984 commercial, were we entering a dystopian society? And obviously we're not 1984 and we're not a totalitarian dystopian society yet. And I don't know that we're going to be. But one of the things in George Orwell's book was a thing called doublethink. And doublethink, different than doublespeak. Doublethink was a thing where you have to accept two mutually contradictory premises as true at the same time. So he based a lot of his book on the Soviet Union and the totalitarian government. And one of the examples he used, not in the book, but in real life, was how Stalin, the leader of the Soviet Union, said in a very famous speech that the Soviet Union was all about the withering away of the state. Well, at the same time, it was about the rising up of the dictatorship, which was the ultimate form of the state. So we're getting rid of withering the state. That's bad, but the state is great. How can both be true? And he said it's a contradiction, but they're both true. Well, they can't both be true. You can't want to get rid of the state and then have the thing that you say is the most powerful form of the state. That was Orwell's example in real life. In our lifetime, I think we have a whole lot of examples of doublethink that go on. Yellow censorship, term limit, skeleton. I agree. I think social companies need term limits. And it's something we've talked a lot about. To me, this topic right now is slightly different than that, right? Because again, I want to get to not so much the censorship that they put on other people, but I will get around to what you're getting at, because I think the whole idea of how social media plays into this is key. I want to just bear me out on this doublethink thing for a second. So think of a couple examples. I'll give you one against the right of doublethink. Donald Trump claimed the election was completely fraudulent, 100% stolen, unfair, illegal in every sense of the word. And as evidence mounted that wasn't the case, I talked to many, many people, often very intelligent people, who insisted it was. No matter what happened, they insisted it was true. No matter how much evidence continued to show that the widespread, they had not, hacked computers. They had not done any of the things that Trump was claiming had happened, or at the level he was claiming it happened. They insisted it was true. How could both things be true? How could it be true that none of the facts you laid out in terms of how it was going to happen happened? And yet it did happen. And I'd ask people and they'd be like, it just did. It's a form of doublethink, two completely contradictory things. Another example is around the thing I mentioned with the transgender thing. How you have two, how do you have the notion that we're biological, our biological sex, right? Male, female, right? That's biology. We're born with it. But at the same time, you choose your gender. It's not, and I'm not saying people can't choose their gender. Gender and sex aren't exactly the same. But the notion that the biological sex exists, yet the trans community in certain forms says the biological sex doesn't really exist. Therefore, if I'm born biologically a male and want to become a female, it's not just a gender choice. My biological sex is no longer a male, I'm a female. So I can compete in sports because I'm a biological female, but you're not. You're a biological male. Both things can't be true. You can't have it both ways. You can't want sex not to exist, but then want it to exist on the other side. That's another form of like a doublethink. Another one where, and I think this all comes into play, and it ties into the media in the space of one of the things of doublethink is you're not allowed to mention things or even recognize things that don't go with that flow of thought. Now, that's where we get into the cancel culture space. You're not allowed to actually think things or say them. And if you do, you'll be shunned. So that's you see happening, right? When people like Andrew Sullivan, the left of center writer who, he's not a progressive, but he has a lot of progressive views. And he was a long-term left of center writer, got fired from the New Yorker for New York Magazine for writing against critical race theory. He was not allowed to say, I agree with all these things that you guys agree with, but not this one. For that, he was going to be removed, not allowed to have that thought. That's where it shows up a lot in the media, I think. And we see that, around a couple big examples. I'll start with the Asian hate crimes, okay? The whole notion that there was a wave of anti-Asian violence, debatable. There is and there isn't. I mean, is Asian hate crime on the rise? Yes. But the numbers get all fudgy. But that said, the argument is that white people commit hate crimes against Asian people because white people commit the hate crimes. And the shooter who went into Atlanta and shot up a bunch of, spas, killed 6 Asian women, also killed 2 white people, wasn't doing it because he hated Asians. He was a white guy who hated Asians. Didn't matter that he didn't have anything to do with it in his mind. Didn't matter that it was about his sex addiction. Didn't matter that he said it had nothing to do with race. Didn't matter he shot white people. It was a hate crime from a white guy to Asians. And that is now on the rise. Yet, in the last week and a half, we had 2 highly visible hate crimes that took place in New York. Take a look at these 2 clips.
The J-Train beating is brutal. Fists flew both ways until they didn't. Eventually, an Asian man passes out after getting punched, choked. The NYPD's Hate Crimes Task Force is reviewing it, working to learn when this happened, what prompted it, and who this man is.
Okay, and I'm going to play you the second one now, also in New York last week.
NYPD has arrested the man accused in that vicious attack on a Filipino woman. The state released Brandon Elliott from prison 2 years ago. Officials say he's out on lifetime parole for killing his own mother. He was seen on surveillance camera on Monday, kicking and stomping the 65-year-old woman very near Times Square.
So the thing about both of these, and that I've said about Asian hate crime, is that they're both black men committing that crime. The largest increase, the largest number of hate crimes against Asians are from black people. More than from white people. Almost 30% come from black people. The media doesn't like to report that. In all the stories I've read, they don't make a point of saying the attacker was black. When it's a white attacker, they make a very clear point of saying the attacker was white. A white man did this. A white person attacked these people. A white person committed this violence. It's not that it's not that part of them can't, they can't admit that enormous amount of hate crime against Asians comes from the Black community, because that would go against the narrative that there's hate crime against Black people. And the truth is, there is hate crime against Black people, and there's hate crime against Asian people, and Black people commit the majority of the hate crime against Asian people. And Asian communities are among the most racist you will find. That's not a racist statement. Go, if you've been around, if you've lived around, if you've known, a lot of Asian families or been Asian communities, they will admit how racist their communities are. Their countries were among and are among the most racist to anyone, but especially to Black people. And even within their own countries, Japan, Korea, China, the Japanese think the Koreans are inferior racially people. And although a lot of white people go, I can't tell the difference, they have very distinct features. I lived in China. I've been to Korea. I've been to Japan. They have very different features. And Japanese people think the Korean people's features are inferior, and they're an inferior race of people. There's an enormous racism within the Asian communities themselves, within the Asian cultures. And there's enormous racism within Asian communities toward Black communities in America. But that doesn't fit the narrative. That doesn't fit the narrative we've laid out. So it's doublethink. That's not true. White people commit the acts of violence against Blacks and Asians. Those two groups aren't racist against each other or against white people. And if you want to argue you can't be racist against white people, I don't know why that's ever been an argument, but you certainly can be racist against minority communities. So if one minority community is racist against another, it cancels itself out. Another last area I want to touch on with this is the Georgia election law. That's another area where you're not allowed to have a sort of a view outside the main one. We're going to narrow that down. It's a form of doublethink. Joe Biden, and by the way, this thing just keeps picking up speed. They're going to move the All-Star game out of Atlanta. Coca-Cola, Delta Airlines came out and said, we're totally against this law. Joe Biden, I said before, Joe Biden called it Jim Crow. He came out and upped it up. He said it's Jim Crow on steroids. And people just accept that. That's just okay. It's Jim Crow on steroids. The media depicts the law as inherently voter suppression. In their news stories, they say the voter suppression law. Okay, first of all, you don't decide it's voter suppression. We do. Secondly, is it voter suppression? I mean, I guess half of you are going to say it is because that's what you've been told. Okay, I'll tell you this. It may or may not be voter suppression to some of you. To me, it's not. There's one voter suppression element in that law. That is, you can't drop your absentee ballots in ballot boxes when the precincts are closed. You can't do it at night in a box that's not got someone at it. It expands the number of days you can vote. It includes Sundays. It expands the time, and it requires you not to keep people waiting in line too long. And it requires you to have an ID, a state ID to vote. I don't know why people keep saying that's voter suppression. It's state ID to do just about anything. You got to do it for in person. You got to have a state ID to buy alcohol. You got to have a state ID to drive. You have to have a state ID to get on planes. It's just state ID to do most things. Having to require you to have a state ID to have an absentee ballot. And by the way, no requirement on why you get that absentee ballot. You can just be like, I don't want to get off my couch and stop watching Netflix, so I'm going to vote absentee. And you're allowed. But it's called voter suppression. But even more, the Jim Crow analogy. And I get so bent out of shape on this. Do you think about what Jim Crow laws were? I talked about Jim Crow a couple days ago, but you know what the Jim Crow laws actually were in general? They required segregation in just about everything, right? Pools, hospitals, old folks' homes. You had to use separate Bibles to be sworn in on, separate textbooks for kids. They were designed to create massive segregation and to disempower Black people because they were Black. And the voting suppression of Jim Crow laws wasn't you have to have a state ID to vote. It was you had to have literacy tests when most Black people, since they had been former slaves, couldn't read. You had poll taxes, $25 to $50 in today's money to be able to vote. You had to own property, which very few Black people did, to be able to vote. Heck, the roles were reversed. Democrats were the big racists, right? The Democratic primaries, which typically were all that mattered, Republicans didn't win in the South, required you couldn't vote in a primary if you were Black because they called themselves clubs and they could therefore exclude you. That was race-based suppression of the vote. Not this, but you can't say that without crossing the line, the double think line. You have to say, no, none of that's true. That's the point of the doublethink. All that is true. Therefore, this can't be Jim Crow. You might think it's suppression. It's certainly designed to try to keep urban people from voting as much, for sure. So I guess you could argue that's suppression, but it's not a voter suppression law. And it's certainly not a Jim Crow law. That one goes hands down, but we can't go there. The last piece on this is that the last thing about doublethink is that you're not allowed to, even if your own experience, even if your mind tells you this doesn't make sense in doublethink, you weren't allowed to think it. And a great example of that is what happened with Captain Underpants. Captain Underpants, the very popular children's book, got canceled. Fans went crazy. Got a graphic of that. There we go. Cancel culture gone mad. Fans react as Captain Underpants book pulled over racism concerns. And let's take a look at the book, Crafty. There it is. Ook and Gluck, Kung Fu Cavemen from the Future. So it's about, quickly, it's about these two guys, cavemen, who go to the future and find a Kung Fu artist, martial artist, who then teaches them the ways of Confucianism to understand better how that shapes your life. A positive book. He wrote it as a positive book. He wrote it, as he said, a book to show diversity, to show another culture's impact and how we can learn from it. But it got canceled because people said the pictures of the Kung Fu artists were racist. And the author, instead of saying, how could it be racist? My entire intent was to create something that showed inclusiveness, diversity. He said, I apologize for my passive racism and I will donate all my money. What is passive racism? I don't even know what that means. It means doublethink. I wasn't being a racist. I was being the opposite. You've interpreted what I did as somehow racist. Therefore, it's racist. It makes no sense. And by the way, where are the cavemen people? They should be out there saying it was a bad depiction of cavemen at the same time. I mean, my God. And by the way, just jumping back for a second to those assaults in New York City, what the F is wrong with people? People watched that woman, 65-year-old woman in the second one, get beat. They watched that man kick a 65-year-old woman in the head. They stood there. It was in front of a luxury condo. The doorman closed the doors. Well, that's where we have gone to with it's like, I'm going away. We are creating a society where everyone's like, I'm not hands off. I ain't going to say anything. I ain't going to do anything. Who doesn't run in there? You know, Crafty said to me earlier, it's like, yeah, but, you know, maybe they want to get beat up. Whatever. I'm going to run in there and get the crap beat out of me before I'm going to let some 65-year-old lady take the hits. Nobody did a thing. Not a thing. Woo. Okay, the last piece is cognitive dissonance. And this is what seems to happen to us, right? We get in a cognitive dissonance. That's where in modern times doublethink goes. We get in cognitive dissonance where we can't make sense. We can't make sense of the cognitive dissonance. So what we do is we simply block. We simply shield. I don't want to see it. I don't want to think about it because I can't deal with a contradiction. And that's what's happening in our society right now. We are moving into a space where because of all these things that don't make sense and we're being told you have to think this and you can't think that. And that's true, but that doesn't make sense because of this. That's not my experience. You know, Me Too movement. Certainly there's a lot of bad things going on, a lot of bad actors, a lot of men who did a lot of bad things, but every guy is guilty of it if he looks the wrong way, does the wrong thing. He's like, but I didn't mean to. It wasn't, I mean, I didn't know I crossed the line. That cognitive dissonance makes people go, I'm just going to ignore everything. And that's bad. That's bad for our society because we become a people who lock down, right? So it reinforces our divisions. We stay more locked into our views than ever. We're going to stay right where we are, you know? Yeah, that's our problem with society. Absolutely. We're all living in it like it's my world, but it is. It's two separate worlds. And the more we reinforce those divisions, we just drill down into our beliefs. What's the bad thing about that other than it's totally unhealthy? Is that the very behaviors you want to stop get worse. The very things you want to go away happen more. The reason, you know, these 2 attacks in 1 week in New York, why? You think they would have happened if we hadn't made such a big deal out of a rise in anti-Asian violence, which wasn't that big a rise, except again, now I'm breaking the rule and saying it wasn't, but it wasn't. It was the number of increased attacks is like, 200 nationwide out of 19 million Asians in a year. And it was higher 2 years ago. So it's actually dropped and then went back up a little. But again, it just brings people out, bad actors. I don't know why. I don't know why more people commit bad acts when they see those bad acts, but they do. It's like it inflames it. We inflame the very thing we want to go away. You want conspiracy theorists? You want people who think the election's stolen to go away? You're only going to make them come out in droves on both sides. We're literally, the media is feeding a frenzy that is simply dividing us so much more, locking us in to a very, very, very unhealthy outcome. And, that outcome becomes ugly in a lot of ways. And one of them is, I think, a lot of people throw in the towel. Suicides in the U.S. have been going up a lot in the last couple of decades. But in the last year, 1 in 4 young adults said they thought about killing themselves. 25% thought about ending their lives. Those of you who may or may not know, I had a brother who died by suicide. It's very personal to me. 1 in 4 young people thought of killing themselves in the last year. And suicides in the last year, they don't know the numbers up till now. They only know up through last year. July through October, 20% increase in suicides, 37% women, and 49% increase in suicide among kids and adolescents in the last half of last year. I mean, that's terrible. But people can't handle it. They can't handle the information that's going on. They can't handle the world we're in. It's like, it's too much. Let me out. Get me out, David Bowie. And that's sad. And that's what we're creating by being so determined to stay in our little camps. I'm right, you're wrong. I'm sticking in my camp, you guys. I ain't backing down. Nephew, I'm unfriending you. That's what we're creating. And the media's feeding it relentlessly. I don't know if they do it because partly they do it because they're businesses and it makes money. The vision makes money. Your own experience, maybe, I don't see racism everywhere I look. I don't see it around everyone I talk to. I'm around a lot of people who aren't like me. I'm around a lot of people who are a different race than me. And I see some, but I don't see what you're saying. Nope, it's true. You have to believe it. The cognitive dissonance, the double think. I'm going to end on a positive note. One of the things that I think has happened in the time we're in is it's created less and less accountability for our actions, for what we think, for what we say, what we do. Social media has helped do that. So has this drive to stick to our narratives. And the whole notion, fairness is overrated, I don't have to give you a platform, is all part of that. There's no accountability. You say something, you don't have to take it back. The media gets it wrong, they just move past it. Oops, turns out it wasn't a white guy who killed all those people. It was a Muslim guy in the shooting in Colorado and Boulder. Well, so we just look past that. Made a mistake. No big deal. But I want to show you an example where there was incredible accountability. This is the clerk. This is the clerk who took the $20 bill from George Floyd, Christopher Martin, and listen to a teeny fragment of his testimony before we go.
I noticed that it had a blue pigment to it, kind of how a $100 bill will have. And I found that odd, so I assumed that it was fake.
Martin and his co-workers tried twice to get Floyd to speak with their manager, but he remained in his SUV. A store employee then called police.
In your mind, during that time period, disbelief and guilt.
Why guilt?
If I would have just not taken the bill, this could have been avoided.
Just think about that for a second. I mean, man, that's a guy with integrity. I feel guilt. What did you do wrong? Guy tried to give you a counterfeit bill and you went after him, say that's not okay? Guilt. If I had just not done it, just not taken it, like as if it's your fault. It's not, but that he has remorse, like I caused this. And then to realize how much of life, how much of our world, they always say World War I started with one gunshot that was totally unrelated, one assassination attempt of the, Archduke Ferdinand, and it started in a worldwide war. The killer had nothing to do with it. I mean, that guy takes that money, they go to get it back. The guy sits in his car, the cops come, and what ensued has changed the world forever. And as I've said before, in some ways we needed to have an awakening, but in some ways it's changed it for the worse. No one's going to say, oh, I'm glad George Floyd's thing happened. No. And that guy sitting there, Christopher Martin, going, I'd feel guilty if I just hadn't taken the bill. I mean, that's accountability, even where it's not your fault. What if all of us did like 1/10 of that? We'd be a whole lot better world. It's Rob Nelson. Thanks for watching.